You're watching Fairfield Public Access Television. I'm Susan Kessel. Connie Boyer's my co-host, and you're watching Opening Fairfield Doors. Our guest today is Jay Marcus, and Jay is a lawyer here in town, an attorney. And Connie, why do we do this show? Let's talk about that.
Well, we really do this show just to bring you people and places in Fairfield that you might not otherwise run into. And hopefully you will appreciate the things that they're doing for our town and in the community, and get to know them a little better than what you might otherwise know of them. So let's just start off then.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Don't know who to look at.
So we're opening the door into your life and who Jay Marcus is. Other than just a candidate, which we're going to try not to talk about very much.
Just a candidate? I have to tell you, this is a pretty consuming position right now, but
I'm sure. Where were you born?
I was born in New York City. I was educated on the East Coast, and so far I'm sure I'm not saying the right things as far as being an Iowa politician. But I grew up actually in Manhattan. I'm 58 years old and was born in the city. And at that time, I think the city was a little bit more of a, not such a hectic lifestyle as it is now, although obviously it's still a big city. When I was 9 years old, though, we moved to a suburb, which, was big still fairly big by Iowa standards. It was a town with probably 75,000 people in it, Rochelle, New York. And all the schools were very big. I mean, I went to a high school that had 2,500 students in grades 10, 11, and 12.
Wow.
So, it was, large classes, big football program, basketball program, etc. But, it was an enjoyable experience, if you could overcome, feeling a little bit lost occasionally and not knowing everybody.
What about your family? Was that where they were from?
Yes, well, my father came to the country in 1905, something like that. He was born in 1899. He was born in Poland, came to the United States, and that family, his family, grew up in Brooklyn, New York. He had a couple of brothers and a sister. And he was a children's clothes salesman, essentially a traveling salesman. And he was away so much, really, because in those days what you did is he had a big car, and he put all the samples in the back of the car, and he would travel to Pittsburgh and, to some of the bigger cities around New York City. And I remember distinctly growing up always thinking, because Dad would be away on a lot of the holidays and things, in season selling, and I always thought Dad had another family somewhere because he seemed always to be, obviously it was kind of a joke, but he was gone, maybe 5 months of the year, it seemed, based on all the travels.
So he sold children's clothes?
Children's clothes.
Were you really well dressed then?
I don't know. That wasn't so important.
You don't even remember that.
It wasn't so important at that time. I think, that was the kind of clothes that he sold were for, toddlers and 5-year-olds and all. And I don't think I was so into clothes at that time.
And your mother?
My mother was also born in New York City. She was born, in the United States. And she was raised also in the Brooklyn area. Had a sister and a brother. She was a very attractive woman. And I remember she was in a few movies, and this is probably when the silent movie days, but they were kind of grooming her so that she was considering actually going out to Hollywood to see about becoming big time. And my father was not into that. And so my mother basically made a choice to get married rather than do any of that. And she was a very athletic person also, and she had lots of friends who were interested in golf, and they got her interested in golf. And so at a very young age, she started playing golf and became a championship golfer. and then some of that rubbed off on us, at least to the extent of getting us.
That's right. You're a golfer.
Yeah, I like golf.
That.
I don't have time these days, but she got me playing, when I was 10 and gave me lessons, and we grew up right near a golf course, and I always used to sneak on and play a few holes in the evening, and I caddied there, and so that was, sports was a big part of my life growing up.
So you played sports in high school,
yes.
Competitive sports. What else did they have golf as a
yes,
as a team sport then?
I was on the high school golf team. My big love, though, was basketball. I was really not very interested in my academics in high school, and was totally, playing basketball whenever I had an opportunity. I remember at one point, all the other kids would go out and play baseball or football, and I would go with them, but I would always find a basketball court, and I was playing basketball. So I did play on my high school team, and then I played in college as well. I played for 4 years at Rutgers University, which is the State University of New Jersey. And that, was also playing sports, on a big state university team was a major part of your college experience, traveling to games, and, the practice season began almost immediately when you got to college, and it didn't end until sometime in March. So it was a very long season, and you were always on the road or always, practicing. You had to be pretty diligent about keeping up with your studies because there was so much time that you missed. But that was, great fun experience playing basketball.
And any brothers or sisters?
I have one sister.
One sister.
One sister is still in the New York area.
And are your parents still living?
No. They passed away really 15 years ago, both of them.
So when you went to college, did you know what you were going to go to school for at that time?
Yes, I did.
So you knew when...
Basketball.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, but it wasn't about being an attorney at that time.
No. I was recruited to play basketball. That was the only thing that dominated in my life then. But I went to college. I enjoyed college, and didn't really even in college know, though, what I wanted to be. I was a business major. And then my senior year, I had a couple of good friends who were applying to law school. And it seemed appealing. I just didn't feel like I was quite ready to go out and just get a job, and wanted, more of an education, and decided that with law there were a lot of options open to me. I was interested in teaching, but I thought as a lawyer I could always teach law. And I was also interested in, either practicing law or perhaps, going into business and being a little better qualified as an attorney. But once I got to law school, I really liked the law. And I thought then that I had found something that really interested me academically. I would have to say in college, I did very well as a student, but I don't think it was because I was really the smartest person or anything like that. It was just that I was very competitive. And so, typically I thought the smartest people in college did real well in some subjects, and others that they weren't so interested in, they just wouldn't bother with. Whereas for me, all subjects were kind of equal. And because I was competitive, I would try and get good grades in all the subjects. So I wound up doing better than, the fellas who were really better students than I was. I was kind of an overachiever in college. But then I did get into a good law school and loved really law school, and really liked the practice of law too. When I started out, I thought it was great, and I've continued to do that.
Was that also at Rutgers, or did you go somewhere else for your law?
No, I went to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, which is a wonderful law school, and got a very good education. And then from that law school went and interviewed for jobs. I remember I interviewed with Richard Nixon, was one of the highlights. He was at the the Mudge Rose firm in New York City, and interviewed with a number of the other bigger law firms, and decided to go with one particular law firm. And it was, a 100-man law firm, which was very big in those days, and got very good training. There was a period of 2 years prior to actually taking that position, though, when I was in the Army. And basically did legal work when I was in the Army also. So there, the legal work was a little different. It was more defending people at court-martials or prosecuting people at court-martials, really criminal law work. Whereas ever since finishing the military, my legal experience has been more business kind of practice, although I've had a few interesting cases that I've helped out on or handled, in some instances, principally in litigation, but mostly it's been a business practice, advising small companies, helping them get financing.
When kids are going through law school, can they focus in certain areas nowadays? I mean, is it specialized enough that they focus in a certain area, or they still get a broad range? And if kids are interested in high school, what should they be preparing themselves for before they get to college to go that direction?
That's a good question. My son is somewhat interested, and I'm not sure if he's drifting around or what, but...
Well, I don't really think that there is a particular field that would best qualify you to be a lawyer. I mean, the thing that best qualifies you to be a lawyer is just your native abilities in that particular area. And probably the best indicator is how well you do on the law school aptitude tests. But I found that very often the people who were the best law students were people who had math backgrounds, engineering or mathematics.
Can pay attention to detail? Is that an issue?
I think it's more that the kind of person who does well in math, who has a very logical, mathematical mind, will do well in the law, because law is really a group of principles that have to be organized and are common sense approaches to a particular problem. And to the extent that your mind is just generally orderly and you can think in a mathematical or orderly way, I think you do well as an attorney. That was my experience anyway. I don't think any kind of pre-law in college means anything. It was very clear to me that you did well in law school also, not even based on how much time you put in studying. It was much more based on just your inherent ability to think in a clear way, to see a set of facts and spot the issues. Because the way teaching goes on in law school is what they call the Socratic method, where you can ask a question, but you typically never get an answer. It's followed by another question from the professor, and what you are doing is being trained to ask the right questions, to see the issues. Because when you're out there practicing as an attorney, if you never ask the right questions, if you don't see the issues that arise, you'll never do a good job for your client. If you see the issues, you can always go to the library and find out the way the law would resolve those issues. But you're totally lost if you don't see the issues in the first place. So the people who do well, I think, as lawyers, the people who do well in law school, are people who have very questioning minds and don't accept things that they're told at face value without inquiring
you
deeply
can ask
into
him
them.
a question, he can turn around and turn it into another question for you.
Well, and I know you're not a defense attorney as a general rule, but this is one question I already had that I've always had is like and maybe this is just TV, but they always throw in these questions like they're double negatives, and it's like, okay, I don't even understand the question anymore. It's like, are they specifically trying to trip you up by the way they ask certain questions? And again, I'm sure that's more involved in maybe criminal law or,
Oh, I think that there are
that
some
kind of
lawyers
stuff.
that may try to trip you up, but it usually doesn't work real well. I mean, I think they probably more often are just getting confused by their own question.
Well, I get confused listening.
Yeah, because there's usually another lawyer there during the questioning who's guarding against the trick question. So I think it's more often just a confused mind that's asking the question.
Okay, well, I guess that makes me feel a little better then. So you've talked about you just touched on it before we went into this whole other tangent about some of the law that you've practiced, mostly business law, and I think you've done some constitutional law. Can you tell us what that really means to a layperson like myself?
the business law is pretty nuts and bolts. It's typically helping people who are seeking financing for their business. So it means helping them with their business plan, with their marketing plan, and then trying to turn that into the kind of document that will allow them to raise money without violating the law. There are securities laws that are very protective of the rights of investors. And then just a general business kind of practice, all types of corporate contracts. It sounds dull, but it's very interesting to me. I enjoy helping people. I enjoy helping them get the money that they need, for a big project in their lives. If I was doing something that was just in the business sphere myself, trying, to sell some product, I don't think I could be nearly as happy as I am when I'm doing this, which always presents a different kind of a challenge, and, for me is just something natural that I enjoy doing. Some of the litigation that I've done has been in the constitutional area, or as a consultant, sometimes in the securities area, in the business area. But the constitutional cases have been typically in the political area and have been some of the most fascinating cases. One involved representing an Arkansas minister who had been very critical of then Governor Clinton, and that was some years ago. And when he ran for Congress, the government-owned television station, public television is government-owned. The employees.
Is that owned by the states individually?
Yeah, it's usually the states.
Okay.
The money, most of the money comes from the state. The employees are all state employees. They're very sensitive to the legislature in terms of how much money they get and whether, their budget requests are fulfilled. Very often the governor appoints the board of the public television. That's the way it is here. It's typically the way it is in most states. So when he ran as a political candidate, the government-owned television station didn't want him to participate in public debates because they knew he was going to be highly critical of the Clinton administration and the people who Clinton had put in charge of the government television station and everybody who was kind of left in Arkansas in government politics. And so they weren't going to let him near a television, when the
Now, was he
debates
third party, did you say?
He was an independent candidate.
Okay.
And a very popular candidate with a big following, Ralph Forbes. And so he brought a lawsuit representing himself. He didn't have any money. And the way he tells the story, I wasn't involved at that time, there was just legions of Clinton attorneys that were trying to keep him out of the debate. And he lost the case at the trial. But then he won at the first level of appeal before the Eighth Circuit. And then the government appealed the case to the United States Supreme Court. And at that point, he needed a lot of help in preparing those briefs. And the Rutherford Institute, which takes a lot of cases of conservative nature where they think the government is being oppressive, especially, and a group in New York and myself all filed briefs representing him, and I spent a lot of time talking to him and trying to understand that case. And it was a fascinating case because whenever the government decides who gets to speak in a political debate, it raises First Amendment issues of the degree to which government can silence its critics. Because if the government can decide for any reason or no reason who gets to participate, then, as one court said, one day they can decide to keep an independent out, but the next day, depending on the political philosophy of those in the government at that time or those in government television, they can decide to keep a Republican out or a Democrat or anyone and really skew the election. So it's a very serious issue, and the government essentially argued at one point, one of their principal arguments was that the government television had to be able to make these decisions for whatever reason they wanted, because we needed to establish this trust in the government television, in public television. And we said, look, trust in the government is not the kind of value that we need to promote with a decision in favor of the government-owned television station. I mean, Thomas Jefferson told us years ago that eternal vigilance and not blind trust is the attitude that we have when it comes to government. So it was a very important case, and at least the Supreme Court decided that the government couldn't decide for any reason or no reason to exclude candidates, that it had to be objective. There had to be some solid objective reason that you could look at. In that case, the reason why I took it is I was familiar with the issues, because when I ran as a third-party candidate, that same issue came up with Iowa Public Television, very much the same issue, because that's government-owned television station. And they were also arguing that we had to trust the government to make these decisions, whereas we said, no, that's not a value to be advanced in society. So it was a very interesting case.
And that went before the Arkansas Supreme Court?
The United States Supreme Court.
Oh, the United States Supreme Court.
Yeah, so,
okay.
It was...
and how does it get that far? Does it have to go to the individual state Supreme Court and then you appeal it?
Well, this case was totally...
How does it get clear up there?
Yeah, it sometimes can go through a state court system and then be appealed directly. This particular case started out in the federal district court because of the federal issue raised, the First Amendment issue. Then it went to the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's the court where you first appeal things in the federal system, and then there it was appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and because of the importance of the issue, the United States Supreme Court decided to hear that case.
How many Supreme Court cases, how many cases do they look at and then say, we'll look at this one, or we'll decide on this one, versus them throwing out and saying, we don't want to deal with that?
Yeah.
How does that work? Do you understand that process?
Well, they have a lot of discretion in the cases that they take. And most of the cases where you ask them to take it, they will not. It has to be an issue that they feel is sufficiently important to occupy their time, and one that is a novel issue that hasn't decided before. They may be deciding that there is already some clear precedent and they don't need to get involved. So, there is a certain art in tailoring your argument to try and get the Supreme Court to take the case, but they do so rarely.
Interesting.
I had a partner in town who actually at one time had a case that also went to the United States Supreme Court, so it would have been interesting if my case had gone, because we were also trying to get my case against Iowa Public Television to the Supreme Court, but it's rare.
I would think there would be some nerves involved in that, meeting all these, the highest court in the land and trying to present your case. Wouldn't that be kind of, I can't mess up, and a lot nervousness?
Well, there's a lot of preparation that goes into an argument before the Supreme Court. You typically consult with other lawyers who have argued cases before the Supreme Court. You go through practice sessions where other lawyers will ask you questions. I did not argue that case myself. I would say I filed my own brief and I was a backup attorney, but I was there in Washington with Forbes. I worked closely with the fellow at the Rutherford Institute on his brief as well as my own brief, and we kind of coordinated our briefs because you had a certain page limit to hit some different issues, and then I was part of the group that questioned him in several sessions so that he would be prepared, and then helped him try and answer in the best way. But it was a great experience. I would have liked to have argued that case myself. I would like to have argued my own case, but that's for another day.
Is it the arguing your case? I know my son he's represented himself twice already in things that he
Maybe you don't want to say this.
Felt so strongly about, that he was accused on a couple things that he really wasn't.
Yeah.
But I think it was just that he so strongly believed in his position and being right that he won.
Well,
both
you
of
know,
them.
it's interesting. At one point, I was writing an article on becoming a lawyer and what sort of the ingredients, the proper ingredients are, besides, having a kind of a mathematical, logical mind. And there are different values, I think, that all of us have that are really important in our lives. For somebody who's an artist, say, it's beauty, which is something that dominates their life and trying to make something as beautiful as possible. Whereas really an accountant, the value that he appreciates is order and balance. And you probably go into most accountants' offices and they're a little more orderly than my own. But I think to a lawyer, to get to the point, it's fairness. That a good lawyer anyway just feels that there's something really wrong when there's been an unfair situation, when somebody's been taken advantage of, and that makes him want to do something. And I think for young people, if that's the value that they see in their own life, that they really are moved to do something when they see an unfair situation in society, somebody taking advantage of somebody else, and if that is the thing that really makes you get off your seat, then you'll probably be a very passionate lawyer and a good lawyer. And it's just different. We all have these different values that really make us respond out there, and it's just kind of your nature, how you are.
I think that kind of speaks to the issue of particularly defense attorneys that have to, even though they know a person's guilty, that they still have to be defended in an appropriate way. I'm sure that's a very difficult thing, one which I don't think that I could do, or that I would have a really hard time with, I think. But there was one particular, I just saw this on TV, and I think this was just in the last year, I think it might have been in Texas, where a gal was, I think, sentenced to the death penalty, and instead of going through, I think she was a serial killer, instead of going through all these other court cases, she just decided, no, give me the death penalty, I want it to be all over. And her attorney, who was really struggling with that because, he felt like he was participating in her death, and yet on the other hand, he wanted her to be able to have her own choice too in that area. And he talked about at one point he cried, and it was just, and obviously criminal cases like that are extreme cases on the emotions and stuff like that. But
That's interesting. How do you feel about the death penalty?
I am pro-life on both
Pro-life.
sides, the abortion issue and on the death penalty. To me, this is God's decision and not ours. I remember some years ago when this issue really came up in Iowa, and I wrote a letter to the editor in the Des Moines Register when they were publishing a whole series of letters. And what I said, and I remembered a conversation that I was having with somebody, but basically what I said is that we are all God's children, and before you make a decision like that, I think you have to try and put yourself in his shoes. I mean, how would a father feel, no matter what the child has done, about the death penalty being imposed on that child? And if we are all God's children, then, I think that at least analogy suggests, what you would do. But it's a tough situation. You certainly don't have
They're
sympathy
always tough
for,
situations.
the people who do these atrocious acts. It's just that I don't think that I'm the one who can make that decision.
I'm
very
glad to
difficult.
hear that you put the death penalty and the abortion on the same. I mean, I always have problems, and I think Governor Branstad supported one and then went the other direction in the other. And I never could understand that. How can he differentiate? He was pro-life for abortion, but he was for the death penalty.
Well,
And it's just a different stage. How can you do that?
It's a tough issue because I will tell you that, the people who do support the death penalty, I understand their arguments too.
Right.
And it's not so much that they are, just punitive people or anything like that. They have a lot of compassion. Mm-hmm. But the compassion that they have falls on the side of, people who have been victims and preventing this from happening again. And some of these atrocious acts. So it's just a very tough, difficult issue. But, the unfortunate thing is with all of these tough moral issues, that kind of go to your heart, where you've got to ask yourself, from deep inside, how you feel about the issues, it creates this divisiveness and people not respecting other positions, and I frankly got very annoyed, even though, I have my own perspective on it and I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but I got very annoyed when there would be a group of politicians saying that we already have the death penalty in Iowa, somebody who commits this atrocious crime dies in prison, that they go to prison for life and there's no parole. But it is not the same thing. It's kind of a facetious argument that minimizes really the arguments of people who favor the death penalty because, there are, reasons, of retribution, punishment for crime, the fact that some of these people go on to commit other serious crimes when they are in prison. There's nothing that they have to be concerned with about a more strict penalty because they've already got the maximum. So you shouldn't, nobody should minimize the other side's arguments. It's just at the end of the day, this is where I come out, but I certainly respect people who come out, in a different way.
I think that's what our show is about, is opening the doors to these different viewpoints, and they're all tough decisions, and we should have respect for each other in their in making their decisions and not come down on them. Right. So that tells again what we're trying to do.
And actually, we touched on this subject the last show we did with Roy Eubanks, and of course he has been in law enforcement for many years. He's retired now and was for the death penalty. And of course, right at that time, the Texas case was up, and where the gentleman had been through 32 appeals and how many years through the court system and spent, probably millions of dollars on the tax system. And in some ways, that seemed ridiculous that all this time and money had been spent on this particular person, when in fact it sounded like he had some pretty bad stuff going on, and so there was the opposite side. So
right,
it's a tough thing. I'm still out on that issue.
The abortion issue
I don't want to have to
also
say.
very difficult.
I don't want to have to say.
It's always more difficult than people realize when it comes down to it.
Well, we know, let's turn the tide a little bit, and we understand that you were involved in a farming operation way back a few years ago. Can you tell us about that, how you got involved with that? And
well, when I first came to Iowa, I joined with a couple of people, and we were the owner-managers, and then we had some investors in a dairy operation, 480-acre operation, where we grew the corn and fed the corn to our own cows. We had about 120 cows. And it shows how little I know about farming to have gotten involved in dairy in the early 1980s when prices were about like they're going now. So we struggled, and we had a lot of problems, and the herd got sick. It had chlamydia, and we had continuing problems, with mastitis, and ultimately we lost the farm.
Was this here in Fairfield?
No, it wasn't. No. It was out in western Iowa.
Okay.
And my job really had to do a lot more with the financial aspects of that transaction and budgets.
So you weren't out like driving the tractor and planting the corn?
No, I wasn't doing that, but I was out there, at the farm periodically. And I am, now also helping some dairy farmers in the area that I know, in Leon, there's a group of farmers that are doing what they call intensive grazing, but they graze on the grass. The cows, are eating the fresh grass when it comes up. They're not in a confinement center. It's an inexpensive way to feed the cows. So they can basically make money even when prices are pretty low, because their cost of input is low. But the real key for their success, especially where you see prices now, $10 a hundredweight, but the real key to their success is if we can help them get a bottling operation or a cheese factory going, because that's the value added where they can use their own milk. And that's really, that and other niche markets is really a very important thing for agriculture today. And, I have been trying to figure out, how we can wrest more funds from the federal government for that area, because it's otherwise very tough for the small and medium-sized farmer to compete with some of the big operations, if you're just selling commodities. But it's a tough life, in small farming, long hours, low pay, and it's just a total credit to the people who are doing that. They love what they're doing. They love being, with the animals outdoors, and so you want to help preserve that way of life. But, it's going to require some serious attention to do that.
I think it is, the way you couched it, it is a way of life, my first marriage was with someone who farmed, and of course we were right in the late 70s, early 80s when, again, interest rates were out of this world, and it fell apart too, and it's really, it's such a shame, because these people are really taking care of, our earth, and unfortunately, for probably a zillion reasons, they're not being supported correctly, and it doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem fair. Plus, then we got people in other countries who are starving to death, and
seems like there should be something to figure out.
But, we could do a better job in providing foreign aid that is not just cash to some of these corrupt governments to then buy guns from us and wage their wars, sometimes against us, but giving food directly to the people. I mean, sometimes what happens is, you provide food to some of these foreign countries, and again, the dictatorships, the food all goes to the military or is kept, by the royal families in warehouses, and it never really reaches the people. But to be able to provide food, is another source for our exports directly to the people. I mean, that would be an important thing to focus on, because exports are so critical to the growth of agriculture, because, there's only so much we can eat here, and the market in the United States is flat. So.
Well, it just seems a shame that the farmers who are producing all the food can barely feed their own families, and I'm sure most of them are probably doing it with their own gardens. Creating and producing their own food and storing it and canning it and freezing it. And, that's what we used to do. And I'll tell you what, put a city girl out on a big garden who doesn't like spiders and bugs. I didn't do very well. I just didn't do very well. I don't know. So.
And how did you end up in Fairfield?
Well, let's see. I was living in New York, practicing law there, then moved to California for a short time and met my wife there. She was working at a television station.
Oh.
But she's an Iowa girl.
She is. Yes. Where was she from?
She was born in Cedar Rapids, and then shortly afterwards moved to Des Moines and went to East High School and then to the University of Iowa. So she had all of her roots out here. My parents had passed away, but basically her family was all in the Midwest. And we actually raced to get out here just before our first daughter was born. We moved here in April of '82, and in June of 1982, Emily was born. And we've been coming out here, prior to that for some years to Iowa. We had friends in Fairfield. I had gotten into a situation where I had a lot of clients that I knew who were involved in the transcendental meditation, and they had come here when Parsons College was acquired. So when we came out here and decided we were going to move, I thought that there would probably be, enough clients that could support my practice. And we just decided that we liked it. This was the kind of lifestyle that we wanted. We saw what it was like for young kids growing up on the beaches of Los Angeles, and we weren't interested in that for our oldest daughter. So we moved out here, and I just figured, if I could practice law, fine. Otherwise, I'd do something else, but we were going to give a different lifestyle a try. And it was very good for me. I immediately found that there were people who really needed someone who had a little more experience in my area. And so my practice really, even after a month or two, was as big as it was in California with clients. And, we never looked back. Not even never went back, but we never looked back. It was nice not to be in traffic jams. It was such a departure for me, coming from a big city or two big cities and, getting into farming, at that time with this farm which occupied a lot of time in western Iowa. And also, what I tell people is at that time when I first came, I didn't know which end of the cow got the hay. I mean, that was about my experience in farming. And it took a little while, to learn some of the basics. But still, I'm clearly not a farmer. There's a lot that I've got to learn, if I'm going to be representing farmers. But what I do know is small businesses, and how to help small businesses. And today, I think it's still the case. A lot of what agriculture depends on is marketing and financing and being an advocate, and not so much knowing when to plant the corn and beans, because there's lots of people who know that better than me. But you always try and get advice from the best people you can, and then you use whatever skills you have.
So you have a daughter, Emily.
I have Emily, who's 18.
18.
And then Kearsey, our youngest, will be 14 soon.
Okay.
And she's going into the 8th grade.
Fun times.
So it's nothing but ladies that I'm surrounded by now and at home.
And your wife now, what is she involved in?
Well, Susan is teaching Sanskrit, actually. She started teaching at the Maharishi School 2 years ago and enjoyed it. And initially was teaching, other courses, but then she was a student of Sanskrit, and there was a need for somebody to teach that, and she liked it very much. And it's a very interesting language,
I can't imagine.
Yeah, it's extremely interesting language. And so she enjoyed it, enjoyed the challenge. She's always been a very good student. I'll tell you one story about my wife, if I can.
Sure.
Well, Emily is, a really brilliant student. I remember when we were in the 10th grade, I would play those little Minesweeper games. She was in the 10th grade. I'd play Minesweeper, which is this mathematical game on the computer. And I was pretty good in math as a kid, and she was much faster than me. And she did very well in math, and she finally made National Merit Scholar and was a finalist. And so when she, got the word, I said, Emily, this is fabulous. You're the first person in the family, to have this distinction. At that point, Susan, meekly raised her hand and said, well, not quite the first. And that was the first time that I even found out, that my wife, had been, I mean, I knew she was smart, and a very good student, but she's also a very humble person. So she had never said that before. But she enjoys, an academic challenge. So she's really enjoyed doing that, and it helps pay the tuition. So.
Oh, good. That's great.
I know sometimes there are things that wives like to not say and just keep quiet about.
Yeah, no, that was a big shocker for me.
That's good.
Oh, well, that's nice.
Yeah.
Well, should we wrap it up? It's getting warm in here again.
Yes, it is. Well, Jay, thank you very much for being here today
Well, thank you,
and sharing some interesting information about your life
And about your
Appreciate that.
family.
and your family.
And Jay did tell us a little story beforehand and he touched on it, that Susan was involved in a TV TV station and such, and being in front of the camera. So, Susan, we may just call you someday.
Yes, you can always
This
use
is the
someone
warning.
else.
Yeah, this is the warning.
So thank you, Fairfield, and I hope that you've found this door that we've opened very interesting.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.